So we're going to go over Hello World in JavaScript. Now, if you Google like Hello World in any language, you'll find stuff, and JavaScript is not an exception. The reason why I'm making my own instead of showing you one that already exists is because with JavaScript being a web language, there's a bunch of different ways you can do it. And I couldn't find a video that showed all the ones I wanted you to see. I could find like this one or that one or sometimes two or whatever, so I'm making my own. Now, there are lots of different applications you can write code in, right? Which we've talked about before in other classes. So hopefully you're aware of that and remember that. For right now, we're just going to stick with TextEdit. Well, for today anyway. And we'll get into some of the other ones later. So I'm going to hit Command Space to use sort of the keyboard shortcut for the spotlight. Type in TextEdit. And it should look like this. This is plain text mode. Now, if you haven't used TextEdit on this computer before, and if you haven't set it into this mode, then it won't look like this. You're going to need to go to Preferences. You're going to need to change stuff to match, well, not even all of these are right. If we do Restore All Defaults, and I open a new one, this is probably what yours looks like. So we need to go into Preferences, switch to plain text, turn some of this stuff off, hop over to Open and Save, display HTML as HTML, don't do that, and that looks fine. Alright, now all of these settings will take into effect only when opening a new file, so we need to close and make a new one again. So just Command N on your keyboard for new. Alright, I'm going to zoom in a little bit just so the text can be large enough for you to see. We're actually going to save this as a .html file. So we talked a little bit about like JavaScript, right? And then it's a web language. So even though we're writing in JavaScript, majority of the time you're still running it through an HTML file. So I'm going to do Command S for save. Hello world.html. The standard for spaces in HTML, or at least on the web, is hyphens. Some people were using underscores when things were pretty new. Some people were using camel case. Google decided that the way that it was going to look at hyphens was that they were going to sort of like represent a space. And so once Google did that, then like everyone pretty much standardized that, and you stop seeing underscores and other stuff for the most part. Unless it's like, I don't know, someone who, I don't know, isn't paying attention, doesn't care, or maybe they have like a really old server from before that decision was made. Whatever, doesn't matter. So we can do save, and there we go, hello world.html. Hopefully yours is .html and you don't get like a .text edition on there. You shouldn't, but if it's being weird, the easiest way to deal with that is to close it on your desktop, click on it, press return to go into like edit mode, like rename the file, and you can delete that part there and then press return again, and that is normally the easiest way to deal with it. So let's go ahead and open this again. Oh, if you try to open a .html file, it'll by default run through your browser. So I need to actually instead open with TextEdit. There we go. So when we are creating a basic HTML file, even if the whole purpose is for JavaScript, we should still have at least a little bit of the basic formatting. So we're not getting into all the exact specifics right now, but we can say that we can open an HTML tag. Let me zoom in again. And we can have a head tag, and we close the head tag, open a body tag, close the body tag, close the HTML tag. So your HTML file should probably at least have those. The head tag and the body tag are nested inside of the HTML tag. This is not programming language, this is markup, right? So in markup, almost every time you open a tag, you need to close it somewhere. So this is all HTML. You open it, you close it. You have the heading tag, which is like stuff not on the page, like information about the page, and you close it. And then you have the body tag, which is the content of the actual page, and then you close it. Not every tag needs closing, but that's the general pattern. So now if we're going to write some JavaScript, then inside of the head tag, well, you can put different places. For right now, let's use it inside of the head tag. So we open a script tag, which that will be JavaScript, and we close the script tag, and here we can actually write some JavaScript. Alright, so the first way I want to show you is with the console log. So to do that, I'll just tab in to sort of show this, this nesting type effect. Console.log, and then in parentheses, we can put the actual string, so hello world, and you know, like always, make sure that you close the string with the same type of quotation. And then in JavaScript, when we finish a line, we end it with a semicolon. And that should actually be all we need for this version of Hello World. So if we save it, and I'm going, well, I guess I'll open it with Firefox. I was going to use Safari. I'll use Safari. Alright, so we don't see anything, right? But if we open the console, which, here we go, show error console. Here we have Hello World right there. Now, error console, right, like this is an error. We printed the console instead, but that's what Safari refers to it as. Because if there are errors, this is where you could see them as a developer when you're checking your page and stuff. And that stuff we'll talk about later. But there we go, there's one version of Hello World. Now what we can also do is instead of console.log, we can do an alert. Now, a couple of things that I kind of like about this right now. So, like we called a function, right? And then we passed through an argument. And when we talk about the web, we are going to get into some object-oriented stuff. Although that's not going to be a big focus for this class, it's still important that you like have at least a rough understanding of it. And so we'll go through some of that. But we already have a little bit of it here, right? So console is the object, and this is a function, a behavior, whatever you want to call it, specifically for this object. So the console has a behavior that it knows called log, and when we pass it through, then it does whatever this function does with what we pass through, which in this case is printing to here, printing to the console. Now another one that we can do instead is alert. And alert is not like object oriented, it's just a command for sort of the whole browser, for the whole page. So if we save this and we refresh this, so command R, that's what an alert does. It does those annoying pop-ups that nobody likes. Now there is a less obnoxious way that we can do this, so let's talk about that. So instead of just calling the alert directly, we can at least let the user decide when they want to call the alert. But to do so, we need to write a function. So let's look at what that looks like really quickly. So we can go ahead and keep this alert here. I'm just going to tab it in and add a little bit more space. So we write function. And let's say that I'm going to call it, I guess, call alerts. Okay, so I like snake case, which is what we use with Python, but JavaScript majority of the time follows camel case. So I guess I'll use that so you get a little bit more used to it. So we can call it call alert, and just like with any other language, after you name the function you need the parentheses, And then for this, to show what's inside of the function, we use these curly braces. And then at the end of the function, we need to close the curly braces. So this is what decides what's inside of the function, these curly braces. So wherever it starts, well, I mean it has to start here, but wherever it ends, like everything between the two will be what's inside of there. Now I still like to use whitespace just because it makes it easier to read, and it is still a common practice, but the whitespace itself does nothing for the computer, it's only for the programmer. And the same thing with HTML, like I indented these to make it easier to see what's embedded inside of what, but the web page itself doesn't need that. You could delete those if you wanted to, which, I mean, saves you a couple characters, which, you know, for like supermassive websites that have like millions of users, some people will talk about doing, but nowadays the web is pretty fast and they don't really see the need for that. But you will occasionally see pages that have like no spacing, and that could be that the programmer is lazy and doesn't care, or that could be that they actually care so much that they want to like save a little bit of space on the transferring, even though it's marginal and doesn't really matter. So now we've defined this function. How do we actually allow them to call the function, right? So if we save this and we run it, there's nothing here now and we don't see a hello world, right? So we need some way to call this function. So in the body, let's make a button. So the body is what's going to show up here on the page. So this is starting to link HTML with JavaScript, right? So before we have this JavaScript embedded in the HTML, but there's no really link, right? It's just holding it like a shell. This will actually create a connection between the HTML and the JavaScript because we're going to make an HTML element here that will call this when you interact with it. So this is just going to be a button, and we need a hyperlink reference, even though it's going to go nowhere. Actually, do we need one? I don't know. Let's try it without. Now what we do need for sure is we need this onClick attribute. This is going to tell it to call the JavaScript. So in here we can do this call alert thing. So call alerts, make sure every letter exactly matches. If you typo up here, make sure you typo there, so that way it knows what it's connecting with. I mean, you could call this gibberish, right? It doesn't really matter what you call it as long as they match. Calling it something that makes sense is just easier for us, the programmer. Ooh, is that enough? Do I need more than that? Okay. Well, let's see if even that minimalistic amount will be enough. Okay, it did make a button. It's not really the way that I'd want to see it, but I think it'll work. It does work. Now, if we actually want to put like some more stuff in here, it's probably easier to add a hyperlink reference, and we could just tell it to go nowhere. Like this is saying, like, basically reference yourself, don't go anywhere. And then after doing that, this kind of changes the tag here. So it's a button, but now it's also a link even if it goes nowhere. And that means that we can close the link with an anchor tag, which means that then we can put text inside of this element, like click me. If we save it and we refresh it, there we go. Now we have a button that actually says something, hello world. Although there's probably another way to do that. Oh, yeah, of course there is. So instead of doing that, if we don't want to add the like extra link that goes nowhere, that extra attribute we don't need, we can also just do /button. That seems to work too. Yeah, there we go. And it's still happy. Without the /button on the end, I'm not sure if it'll behave itself because it doesn't necessarily know when to end the button, and it might not know where to put the click me. So if we save that, we reload. Oh, it's still working, but some browsers might load it a little differently, so it's a good idea to close out that tag. Yeah. Now you can see all these previous logs in here, just because I keep refreshing. Alright, so there is a few more ways that I want to show you how to do this. So we've done the console.log, which shows it here. We've done the alert that makes a pop-up. we've done the button that calls the pop-up, and that's starting to link the HTML, right? So there are, of course, more ways. Getting back to the idea of linking the HTML and the JavaScript, let's look at another sort of object method type setup. So if we do document.write, this is calling the HTML document itself, and it's going to write whatever's in here. It's that same sort of pattern, right? You've got the object, you've got a method or a behavior that it understands, and the argument you're passing through. And this gets into the DOM, the document object model, which we haven't talked about, but we will get into later, and I'm not going to really cover here, but you're going to start hearing that phrase occasionally, the DOM, the document object model. So if we save this and we refresh it, oops, oh, because I made it a function. There we go. I guess that's kind of cool. We can get rid of this function if we want and just make it the whole thing just automatically run without any call. If we refresh it, now we're writing this to that. Now, sort of interesting, it wrote this and then it wrote that, and so it did both, right? But a moment ago, when we had the function there and we clicked this, it wrote over it, right? It replaced it. So part of that depends on the way that it's reading things, right? So this is a interpreted language. It goes line by line by line and does things in that order. So when we do it this way and we refresh it or we run the page, it writes this, but it doesn't call it, right? It's got this in the memory, and then it gets down to here and it loads the button, and then when we click the button, then it does this, and it is writing a new document. It's not concatenating, it's not adding to it, it's basically like looking at what's on the document and changing it to this content. So that's why when we click it, it overwrites it, because it rewrote the whole document. When we delete this part here and we run it this way, it wrote the document first with hello world, and then as it continued down, then it saw the part to write the button, and then it wrote this afterwards. That's why you see both here, but you don't see both when we call the function. So that's just sort of understanding the way that it reads the script and then writes based on that order. So yeah, we'll talk about interpreted languages versus compiled languages later to make sure you really get it. Alright, so there's one more bit that I want to show you with this JavaScript hello world type stuff. So we did document.write, and that writes to the whole document. But what if we don't want to modify everything? So let's say sort of in here, maybe above the button, we say like, let's add an h1 tag. This is a header tag. And we say, I don't know, large text. Let's just directly say what it is, I suppose. Then we close h1, right? And then we can do maybe some paragraph text. So whatever, I'll just stick with my method of like saying exactly what it is, paragraph text. And we close the paragraph element, although I guess this should be like header text. Alright, let's say we make this into something that makes more sense, because it's not call alert anymore, it's like call function, because we're just using it as a function. Alright, so we've got header text, paragraph text, we've got this function we wrote earlier. Let's make this a little bit longer, there we go. And what do we actually want to do with it? So right now, like, these are just basic elements, and if we save it and we refresh this, you can see them there, header text, paragraph text, and this button that replaces everything, right? Now what if we don't want to replace everything? What if we want to replace just part? So we can actually add IDs into these elements and just change what's in those elements. So let's call this like ID equals, we'll do h1 for header 1, and maybe here we do ID equals p1 for paragraph 1. Now we can actually call these individually, or just change part of the page, which is cool. So instead of document.write, we do document.get elements by ID, and notice this camel case, right? And then here we don't say hello world, here we actually specify the ID. So if we want the header, then we do h1, and then after the parentheses, after we specified which one, then we actually need more behaviors, right? So we're calling this behavior of the document, and then in there we're going to specify that we want to change the inner HTML of that ID. And this starts to get a little long script-wise, right? But it's okay. Now we can say equals, and now we can actually say what we want it to say. So here we can say hello world. And if we save this, that all looks good. I think that's all we need. We refresh this. Alright, so no change yet. Click me. There we go. Now does that change there? And we can also change the text below it, right? So we can copy this whole line and paste that in, do some tabs for white space. This now needs to be P1, and this needs to be, I don't know, something else. Whatever, it doesn't matter. So if we refresh this, now it changes both, right? And so you can have lots of different elements in here that you have basically rewriting through JavaScript on some effect or whatever. Now, right now we have these based on a function call with this button. Let's go ahead and delete the button, and let's go ahead and get rid of the function call. And this is just something important to be aware of. I touched on this slightly last time, and yeah, let's go ahead and talk about this. So here I'm running this script, and I'm referring to elements on the page before it loads. So hopefully you have a prediction on what that's going to do. Right, so it didn't change, right? So hello world para, we have header text, paragraph text, didn't change. And here in our error console we actually have an error, right? So it's saying that null is on object, evaluating blah blah. Basically, we told it to find the inner HTML of the h1 elements, and it's saying that there isn't one, null, like it couldn't find it, it couldn't do it. And you're saying, but it's right here. But keep in mind that it does things in order because it's interpreted. So that means it runs this before it has even created this ID, or well, this element with an ID tag. So it can't find it. So order is important. So you might be thinking, well, does that mean that I have to use the function then? No, you could, but you don't have to. Instead of having the function tied to a button, we could keep the function and tell it that once it finishes loading stuff, then it calls that function. And that could be through a tag down here, that could be through some other tags we haven't talked about, or you could just grab this script and move it down here. Now that's a little weird because now you have scripts that are like at the bottom of the page instead of the top of the page, and some programmers don't like that, but it still works. It sort of depends on how you want to do stuff. I like the idea of having a lot of your script up top, pretty much all the script you can at the top of your HTML document, so that way you know where it is, and that's sort of the traditional place to put it, but you don't necessarily have to. So now if we save this and we run it, there we go. So it creates these, and then after it's created those, then it writes this script. So your script does not have to be called in the head, it can be called from the body, just the head is basically the typical place for it. So there you go. That's like hello world through JavaScript, like what, 5 different ways? I don't know, something like that.